Hello and welcome to the latest BCIS webinar looking at construction forecasts and navigating inflationary risk. So my name is Richard McLean. I'm the Chief Markets Officer here at BCIS. So a very warm welcome to you all and thank you all for taking the time out to join us. So just a quick bit of housekeeping. So some of you will have seen already that we've published 6 poll questions. So if you haven't already had the chance to look at these, please do and answer them if you're able to. So just on the taskbar on your screen, you should see this logo that's for the polls. So these questions really are just to help us understand what the environment you're working in is at the moment and the particular challenges that you're facing. So we'll publish the results at the end of the session and we'll publish these and email them out to you. And likewise, please feel free to ask any questions you have throughout the webinar using this chat box. So if you just see the question mark symbol, you'll be able to enter them in there. We will go through as many of them as possible at the end of the session. But for those questions that we do not get around to addressing during this short session, we will be continuing the discussion using the BCIS LinkedIn page. Again, all of the questions are collated and we'll answer them and circulate with all of you who are attending. So if we don't get to address yours, don't worry, we will get it addressed. So this session will be recorded and it will be made available on BCIS. So in case you encounter any technology problems, please don't worry, you will get the chance to watch and ask questions after this event. So the questions certainly aren't closed after this and will stay in discussion. So when leaving the session today, you will be prompted to give feedback on this event. The feedback will help us make sure we're delivering what you want in the future. So please, if you can spare a few minutes, take the time to answer. Also, do let us know in this survey if you have any topics that you would like us to focus on the future events. As I'm sure you know, most of the events that we are carrying out at the moment are all our customers led. So, you know, any hot topics, we hope we're covering them, but if we're not, please let us know. So with regards to our presenters today, our expert panel, I won't include myself in that, but I'll be hosting. As I said, I'm Richard McLean, Chief Markets Officer. However, our expert panel that will be helping us is Carl Horton, who's our Chief Data Officer, and Joe Martin. I'm sure most of you know who Joe is, but he's our lead consultant. So today's agenda will be covering throughout the webinar the following 4 topics. So first of all, what forecasts can tell us about the construction market. Now, forecasts used in all industries, sectors throughout this webinar. We'll consider some of the forecasts that are produced by BCIS and the sorts of things that we can take from them. So next up, we're going to cover different approaches to forecasting and where the potential pitfalls lie. Now, we know different professionals, different firms, different sectors might have a variety of ways in which they work and put out their cost predictions. So it may largely be driven by the data you already have to hand. Some of these may be more reliable than others. So we're just going to review this and take you through. Next after that is BCIS's track record in forecasting and what we've learned. I haven't actually seen these slides yet, so I'm hoping they're positive, but we'll find out together on that one. But in all seriousness, you know, we've been forecasting construction costs for decades with a huge amount of data and also experience in our team. None claim to be psychic, so we'll talk about the wide range of sources we use to generate our projections and what we do when the really unexpected happens. We've all been fortunate enough to really see what happens when the unexpected happens recently. So we're just going to go through this in a little bit more detail. And then finally, how using appropriate construction indices forecasts can increase cost confidence. So we believe that if you use forecasts that are more appropriate for the exercise you're undertaking, whether it's an early cost plan or detailed budget, you'll find increased cost confidence. So lots of different kinds of forecasts, all used in the construction world, all the different uses and benefits. So if we start at the top here, we've got the general economic forecast. So things like CPI, RPI, tracking general inflation, not specific to construction, though there may be some broad parallels in movement. Next, we have general construction forecasts. So specifically based on industry activity and the market. So for example, BCIS's General Building Cost Index or the All-in TPI, really good indicators of general trends in the industry. Then next we have sector specific forecasts. So example, road, rail, water and sewerage include resources common to those subsectors. And then finally, work category forecasts. So this is our new area of work. These are forecasts at a granular level, individual resources and work categories, which we're really excited to share more about with you today. So just to give you an idea of what forecasts we have at BCIS, first of all, we've got the cost indices. Now, often referred to as the factory gate prices. These are input cost resources, so it's labour, plant and materials to the contractor, of which we may have many. Hopefully some of you already use and recognise some of these. General Building Cost Index, General Civil Engineering Cost Index. Tender price indices, these are tracking movements in contractors' price levels in accepted tenders, so i.e. the cost to the client. We currently have two panels. First of all, we've got a UK-wide panel and then we've got a Scottish panel specifically. So they're made up of cost consultants who work with clients across all kinds of projects in the private and the public sectors. Now, they really do give us a fantastic range of insights into tendering climate each quarter, talking to us about things like risk sharing and how this is done, contractors' appetite to tender, procurement routes, logistical challenges, and how projects are impacted in real time by things like changes to building regs and safety laws, and also public sector budgets. So outprice indices, these are measuring the average price of projects at outturn, so i.e. the movement in prices paid by clients when the work is actually carried out. And we have the BCIS all-in OPI, which, like our other forecasts, project 5 years into the future. And finally, as mentioned, these are the work category forecasts which I mentioned, of which there are more than 150. So we've just launched, which are called the BCIS forecasts of PAFI. I'm sure most of you know what PAFI is, just in case that's our price adjustment formula indices. So really excited as these are the only forecasts available in the industry which are looking at this level, at individual resource and of work category. So you can see how vast they are, starting ourselves at demolition, down to decking, plasterboard, ceilings, screeds. So it's quite a vast range available. And as you can see, the cover building, civil engineering and specialist engineering works. So when we get into from civil engineering, labour, transport and logistics, cements, it's obviously always a hot topic, hopefully less, timber, another major, and fuel as well. As I say, these get done every single month to make sure we're mitigating as much risk as possible and keeping you very specific. I'll come back to these particular forecasts later in the webinar and talk a little bit more about what they are and how they can be used in different ways. But hopefully just looking at some of the names on the indexes we have shown you so far is the level of which our forecast is going now. But anyway, enough from me. So first of all, to talk a little bit more about forecast and why it's so important to be aware of the risks of inflation on projects, I'm going to hand over to our Chief Data Officer, Carl Horton. So Carl, over to you.
Thanks, Rich. That was a great intro and help and showcase the comprehensive suite of indices that we actually forecast at the BCIS. So before we get into our own forecasting and how we think using appropriate forecasts to help with cost estimating and project planning, I just wanted to kind of consider, I guess, what actually is a forecast and why does inflation matter and what are the inflationary risks to a project. And as construction professionals, I'm sure I don't need to tell everyone on this webinar about the effects of inflation on project costs, particularly in the last few years. So if we start with general inflation, as the graph highlights, general inflation, in this instance measured by the Consumer Price Index or CPI, in the most recent years has been very high, with double-digit inflation witnessed for the first time in decades. And if we start to now consider inflation in the context of construction, we can see that across the same period, the BCIS General Civils Cost Index has witnessed inflation above general But since the turn of the year, we've now started to also see civils costs on a downward trajectory. So let's now add another consideration, material costs. So in the chart, we've now plotted one of the more volatile materials used on construction projects, steel. Steel, over the same period, has seen extraordinary peaks and troughs. So whilst CPI peaked around 12%, steel materials peaked around plus 70%, only then to rebound around 18 months later, with deflation recorded at about minus 35%. Again, staying on the theme of materials, if we add two further key items to our chart, namely timber and fuel, again, we can see the inflation profiles are very different, with timber actually reaching peak inflation levels above that of steel, whereas whilst also witnessing deflation at similar levels to steel as well. And finally, even if we consider components that consist of the same base material, in this instance, precast concrete, structural components, which includes things like pipes and is indicated on the purple line on our chart, have performed very differently to non-structural components, which is highlighted by our blue line, with a differential of over 10% between the peaks. So we understand that indices perform differently, but what these indices also tell us is that timing is everything on where the cost may be at when at tender stage against where they might be when they need to be on site. This inflationary risk highlights a big difference and one highly important for cash flow management across projects. So let's consider timing and linking it to materials. So steel rebar is another prime example when we're looking at a movement in costs and how, depending on when you're estimating for a project or actually buying in materials, you can look at significantly different costs. Rebar was selling for as little as £389 a tonne in August 2020 in the depths of the global pandemic. And by January 2021, it was £585 a tonne. And for those that like to do the inflation calculation in their head, that is roughly 50% more than what it was in August. And if we then fast forward to July that same year, the price had increased to £749 a tonne. So again, another 60% increase from where we were in January. So as we then head into 2022, you can see that prices rose to more than £1,000 a tonne and actually peaked at around £1,200 a tonne in April. So as I said, timing is essential when we're looking at inflation. And just using this as one example of steel, we started out at August 2020 with a price of £386 a tonne and finished at £1,200 a tonne in April 2022. So just in 2 years, the price had gone up by over three or four times. So really, it has to be a consideration when we're navigating the risk and where does that risk lie on our projects. So what does it mean in the context of our projects? So the impact of inflation needs to be considered from as early a point in the project as possible. And there are lots of questions and considerations to take account of. Affordability and accessing of funding, to bid or to not bid. On what grounds might there be negotiation? Varying lengths of projects, so how does your confidence differ between short and medium term? Tendering now for 2025 works, what will have happened by then? Will there be a need to split the work into smaller work packages? And would you enter into a fixed price contract? Are there provisional sums for some trades and resources? Are there risk sharing mechanisms? So is there a fluctuation clause included within the contract? Or is all the risk of inflation put on the contractor? Practical questions like buy steel now and store it or buy next year. Tender prices can be overinflated or underestimated. Both carry risk. These are considerations that have to be made by Tier 1 contractors through to specialist subcontractors and also by funders, financiers and investors. Not an easy decision to make. Consequences can be serious. Not to put too much of a dampener on what we know now, but in the high number of insolvencies we've seen coming out of COVID and the last year, there's been a lot of disruptions to cash flow, the impact of resource inflation being too great to overcome. Vitally important to get insights which can ease the difficulty of being able to plan for a financially prudent way. So there are different ways of forecasting can be done. We typically categorize different methods of cost estimation, prediction, forecasting, or basically trying to make an educated guess on what's going to happen into 3 broad camps: hindsight, insight, and foresight. So we start with hindsight, and luckily enough, we all have it, some of it more than others. It's basically our experience of previous and current projects. So we can get to consider the things that have happened, like the global financial crisis, or what happened after Brexit, or the invasion of Ukraine, or COVID. What happened to material prices last year, and how have things like home buyers responded to high interest rates? We get to use that information to help predict what is going to happen in the future by understanding how the markets reacted at that given point. So let's now consider our second category, which is insight. Again, we all have it in varying degrees. It could be in a knowledgeable supply chain, or it might be through work on projects where historical data has been plentiful and has been shared. Experience that enables us to see the cyclical nature of the construction industry, how building and civil engineering work tends to fare in response to external forces. Although using generic economic forecasts as a means of projecting costs, when we know people use that, we would advise against when thinking about specific construction projects. It does give us good insight into general market movements, but it's not the only consideration. But there are things like the latest Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. So if you're in the house building sector, there's not much more salient information at the moment than what's happening with interest rates. Likewise, tracking commodity price indices and how relationships between manufacturers and merchants, how they plan to put scheduled price increases and when they're likely to happen. What clients are saying and fellow professionals and trade bodies are really insightful information and good snippets into forecasting. And things obviously wider outside of industry, and things like conflicts in places like the Middle East, and how that will impact on fuel supplies and costs, and in turn how energy intensive processes will impact on the resource costs in the future. Likewise, what the government has announced and what it'll do in terms of wages and national insurance, and how that will affect labour costs in the future, are all things to consider. Changes in building regulations, so how will that impact on the supply and demand when it comes to certain material types, and of course labour. And there are things like taxes and how VAT impacts on plant and machinery in the future. Our final category is foresight. And I guess the ability to look forward with a very reliable degree of cost confidence is much more difficult to find. Here at the BCIS, we would like to think we have good foresight. We bring together all of our hindsight, so everything that the data has told us for more than 60 years of collection, through cycles of boom and bust, through a pandemic which delivered the biggest hit to GDP since the Great Frost of the 1700s, all combined with our list of insights. We not only know what the changes to building regulations are through our panel of house builders, but we also understand the additional costs that are required to meet them. Just last week, our data team were picking through over 110 measures announced in the autumn statement to assess which will have a direct or indirect effect on our industry. Not just tracking commodity prices, but understanding the processes of raw materials that produce our building resource prices. Some other things we incorporate into our consideration when we're modelling. Movement in individual indices for resources, producer price indices, including many which aren't publicly available. We gain insights from our expert of industry panels. And we have, of course, over thousands of cost analysis that we've used to analyse and model construction costs. Subscribers will also know of all our briefings that we produce. So our 5-year forecast that we produce each quarter also includes a set of assumptions on which the forecasting has been based, as well as a risk matrix which outlines a number of the external factors that we recognise can have an effect on our indices and on our projections, be it in an upward or downward direction. These are environmental factors that our team are constantly monitoring. Things like industrial unrest, levels of insolvency in the industry, the impact of sudden workloads like remediation work on RRAC, global energy markets and net zero targets, extreme weather events, to name but a few, are all things that we consider as part of the foresight that help us inform our forecasting. So when it comes to forecasting, what do we do here at the BCIS? I guess if you think about the analogy of a cooking pot, we have lots and lots of ingredients that goes into our forecasting. We've done years and years of modelling. We take into consideration things like national statistics. We also combine things like professional judgment. We have over 60 years worth of experience in delivering and understanding what happens in the industry. We combine things like wage awards and average earnings statistics. We look at things like industry outputs and new orders. We consider things like producer price indices and services producer price indices. But we also look at more industry level, where we look at spending plans, what's happening within different sectors, project pipelines, so what major projects and what minor projects are coming onto the market, which may impact on resource demand. And of course, we also consider those economic forecasts. We don't ignore what is happening with general inflation, so CPI, RPI, or the base rate. All these things combine to what we consider in our forecasting pot. So just building on all the different methodologies that we've talked about and considering the hindsight, the insight, the foresight, and between all these sources, with everything that's happened, everything we know is happening now and is going to happen in the near future, we're able to make an educated calculation on what is the most likely trajectory. But I'd like to just pause there to make the point that using the most appropriate index or forecast is important. At early cost stage, look to use something like the General Building Cost Index or the All-in Tender Price Index. When considering more detailed cost plan, you need to be starting to tailor your indices based on the type of work or category of work that you're undertaking. So I appreciate I've given you a lot of information to digest about inflation risk on projects, the different categories of forecasts, and also highlighted some of the ingredients that go into our BCIS forecasts. But I also wanted to take the opportunity to remind you to make sure you're using the most appropriate index for forecasting. Now, I think the basket of goods are a good way of demonstrating the difference in using something like CPI or RPI versus a construction project. I would ask you to consider what ingredients you want to base your project expectations on. Is the CPI RPI basket of goods relevant versus what's actually happening in construction? Now, if anyone hasn't seen it, we did a webinar on choosing the right index earlier in the year, and we also published a guide on the same topic. Do get in contact with us if you're unable to locate them but are interested in seeing them. I'm delighted to say that Joe is going to share a worked example with us shortly, showing how our PAFI and work category forecast indices can be used to line up against the different elements of a project, giving a more reliable method of assessing what's likely to happen to the costs over the planning and construction phases. Now, because these forecasts have just been launched, we don't have this historic data to display how they've panned out against inflation in real terms. However, the data team who have been forecasting our indices for decades have built a high degree of knowledge to support our forecasts. Just take a quick look at the General Building Cost Index, which has decades of data behind it. Overall, our performance has been positive, with only a global pandemic impact on our most recent performance. What's important to say is that it would be disingenuous of us to sit here and imply we've got a special construction crystal ball hidden away in an underground bunker in Coventry, and we know exactly what's going to happen all around the world, that we saw COVID coming or that Putin would decide to invade the Ukraine. The volume of claims of force majeure going in after COVID show that we do face major unprecedented events which can turn the industry on its head. And there's very little anybody could have done to foresee or prepare for some of the things we've experienced in recent years. What we do know is our hindsight, insight and foresight add up to a lot. More than 60 years of analysing data and a very experienced team, including construction economists, skilled at taking what's happening in the wider economy and applying it to what that means for the construction industry. We bring together a wide range of sources, lots of data, and apply human experience to it. Even when something so unprecedented happens, nobody could have foreseen it coming. Everything we do know allows us to update our models accordingly and be much more reactive and agile to flag future cost pressures. We do this so you don't have to. Now I'll hand you over to Joe, who is going to take you through a worked example. Over to you, Joe.
The available forecasts are mainly for a typical or average building. So the price indices are generally made up by averaging project indices for different projects. So they are a mix of constructions and types of work. And the cost indices are generally based on a model or weightings. When I started to get involved in compiling indices, I used to weight things together, and I was very impressed by people who talked about the models they based their indices on. It was only when I was at a conference that I realized that they were the same thing. So cost weightings and models are the same thing. They're just a mix of materials, labor, plant, or whatever that you're going to mix together to produce your indices. So using them is an assumption that the cost movement you're looking for is an average of trades and resources throughout the period. but in practice every project is different, and the weighting of trades and resources and the rate at which you spend money on the different trades will differ from project to project. I'm going to talk about forecasts that are currently available and how we use them, and how there might be some advantage in using the forecasts at a more detailed level. So what we use at the moment are forecasts of cost indices and price indices. Of course, cost and price are the same thing in any transactions. The seller's price is the buyer's cost. We tend to use cost to mean what the industry pays for resources, and the price what it charges to clients. The cost indices like our general building cost index and our general civil engineering cost indices, and the price index like our tender price index, where forecasts are available. Well, what do we use these forecasts for? Well, we forecast project prices when we're putting prices on projects from inception stage right through to pre-tender estimate. We have an estimate at a particular point in time, and we want to convert that to the price that the client might actually pay, which is sometime in the future. Similarly with programs for hospitals, schools, or anything else where you are trying to plan a program of work going many years into the future, you will be putting estimates on those projects that are in the program, but you will want to see what they are in cash terms so you can discuss budgets. We forecast cost estimates, which will be built up from resource levels, and we forecast the impact of inflation on a cash flow. So here are the weightings from our roads cost index. I'm not suggesting that you try and read it, but it just shows that we're weighting together different resources, and we're giving them different weights as they appear from our researchers to representing across the industry for roads. But quite clearly, these costs will occur at different times. So asphalt or tar macadam is likely to occur towards the end of a project, unless, of course, it's a resurfacing project, in which case it brings home how you need to understand what your project is. Here's a simplified program for a single-story primary school. I've simplified it so it will sit on a slide. It illustrates that the trades have different weightings and expenditure on them occur at different times. So that if you are looking at a forecast for the average, even if it's the average of weightings for this particular project, you'll get a different result than if you look at the forecast and apply it to the expenditure when it occurs. Here's a graph showing the various trades that were included in the program over the program period. And it shows that they do move at different speeds and at different times. The top one is concrete reinforcement. This is through a period when steel prices went crazy, but you would have used the steel in the reinforcement in the first part of the program. Therefore, you wouldn't have hit that big lump. The other one that shows about a third of the way through the program is timber windows, where again timber got very expensive at one time during the period. But again, the timber windows would probably be installed maybe 2/3 of the way through, or maybe before that, and would not have reflected that lump in the price rises. But the question is, does it make a difference to use trades and work category indices and apply them to the program to estimate the increased costs, rather than using a single index based on the weighting of those same resources, or using a general measure of costs? Well, the answer is yes. I have applied the trade indices to the program, and produced this increased cost of 1.2 million. When applying a single index, you need to decide how to apply it. Rule of thumb is to apply it to the midpoint of the period. Obviously, if you have the cash flow, you might appoint it to the midpoint of the cash flow rather than the midpoint of the dates. But this is the result that I got by applying it to the mid period of the contract, and a significant difference. By applying the general building cost index in the same way, I got a significant difference. Now, the mix of things in the general building cost index is different from the mix of things in the simplified example. It does include other trades, but it does show that by using a mix of labour and material, and plant and resources that isn't appropriate to your particular project will produce you a different estimate of increased costs. And the advantage of this is transparency and clarity, so you can give your client a much greater transparency about what the increased costs might be on his project, and that can only be good for you and your client.
Looking at the forecast indices, we're not expected quite such a bumpy ride as we've had over the last 2 or 3 years. But there are still pressures that will come through, particularly on wages, where a lot of labour has lost out with inflation eating into their real wages. So here's just a selection of our civil engineering forecasts. And you will see that the labour is expected to rise quite significantly. Some of the materials, particularly steel, where prices in recent years are likely to mean that we don't see quite high prices over the few years. So there are still big differentials between what we're forecasting and the indices. Applying the indices at the resource or work category will still give you a better understanding of what the increased costs on a project might be. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Richard McLean, who will take this forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Joe. That was really great. Hope everyone found that incredibly helpful. Hopefully everything you've heard today makes the case, not just for using construction specific indices for forecasting, but using even more specific indexes which most closely match the actual makeup of your specific projects. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more of the work category forecast that we have recently launched. So, looking at the work categories forecasts, I flashed up a long list of all 157 of them earlier. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through them again, but just to show you what we have in each of the series, from building through to civils, highways maintenance and special engineering. Work categories are types of work, so they include labour, materials and plant, like for example brickwork. The resources are groups of similar materials, labour or plant, like bricks, precast concrete, building labour or scaffolding. So our forecasts include the historic data from our price adjustment formula indices, so which hopefully many of you will be familiar with. So it's the same structure, the same categories, plus a 5-year forecasted projection. So we've just used PAFI as a basis to build those forecasts on. The indices can be used to forecast the cost of a particular item of work, or several indices can be weighted together to represent the mix of work in a project to create a tailored forecast for that specific project. And actually, as I mentioned at the start, we see multiple uses for these forecasts, where you want to be able to anticipate the effect of inflation on things like cash flow, on new and future projects, for clients on their programs of work, for contractors' orders books, and when looking at specific sectors and types of work within those. Which leads me in nicely just to talk a little bit more about the benefits that we think you have gaining from working with forecasts at this level, to be able to look at what's happening at an input cost level. Now, of course, managing cash flow is everything, particularly in an industry where the contract and payment cycles can be so notoriously difficult to navigate. That's particularly at a time when finance is so expensive. it can be problematic in both directions. If you overborrow or underborrow, you can make an already difficult position worse. The importance of healthy cash flow and having confidence in spending plans is something I think has come out really clearly in what we've just seen around insolvencies in the past year, for example. So there's not a lot we can do about the actual price of resources, unfortunately. I only wish there was, but it's having that foresight that Carl talked about earlier, for example, to be able to plan accordingly. And sometimes that might mean taking on a project, and sometimes it might mean steering well clear. Now, of course, what we're talking about is being able to make better informed decisions, which Carl also covered. So in making the best decisions based on all of the information that you have to hand, in setting out the cost for a project, which will eventually save money in the long run, it's to bid or not to bid, how high to bid, to invest or not, take on labour or not, buy now or later. So we also know using forecasts like these help to save time. So essentially we've done all of the work, utilised all of the data and put our best minds on it. So you don't have to try and take all of the historic data you have from your projects or remodelling or reweighting something like the CPI, for example, then have to fashion it into something you can use moving forward. So you can use the appropriate forecast index for the stage of the project you're looking at and plug those numbers directly into your model. So forecasts can also be used to help with value engineering or avoiding future cost pressures. With an awareness of impending inflationary risks, it is possible to amend plans or essentially design your way out of trouble. Now, again, in some cases, it might be prudent to take stock and wait a little than wade in. And finally, in terms of bargaining power, we believe detailed forecasts can give you a more solid knowledge base from which to approach negotiations on tenders and with which you can adjust your appetite for risk accordingly. Right, okay, so that's probably enough from me anyway. So if we move on to a couple of the questions that we've had, I think the first one, Joe, I think if you wouldn't mind taking this perhaps. So the question is how quickly do the forecasts take into account of economic and world events?
How quickly do forecasts take account of economic world events? Good question. It depends what they are. Some things like wage awards have a due date, which we will implement in forecasts. And changes in national insurance and tax changes that might affect employers' costs. But with things that don't have a direct effect, like OPEC announcing that it's going to cut the amount of oil that's being produced, we have historic records that will look at how quickly that cutbacks would impact on prices and what sort of increases they're likely to be. We'll also look at things like, does the price per barrel make it more effective for the shale oil producers in Canada and the United States to start producing oil, which will dampen the effect. So we are using our experience to try and interpret what will happen.
Great, that's wonderful. Thank you, Joe. And we've got another one here. Carl, I'm going to ask you to pick this one up if that's okay. So the question is, so what do you predict will be the most volatile resource in the next few months or years? And how can we plan for this when budgeting?
Thanks, Richard, for passing that one to me. No, that is a question, I guess. So what's the best way to answer it? So utilising a combination of our insight and our foresight knowledge, for those of you that hopefully paid attention, the downward trend of construction output in certain sectors, I guess, has indicated that a lot of the volatile resources have started to stabilise in most recent time, and actually we're starting to witness and forecast deflation in certain sort of key resources like steel, for example, and timber as well. I guess looking more longer term, one of the key inflationary drivers really is labour, and that is really underpinning a lot of the sort of general construction inflation at the moment. As I said, with the kind of peaks that have happened in recent time with resources, the bit that's sort of really sort of keeping positive numbers in this space is definitely labour. I guess in terms of sort of how to plan for this within sort of budgeting, again, definite soundbite to what we talked about in the webinar. Wherever possible, align your project information, your costings to the most appropriate index forecast as a starter for 10. If you do have sufficient detail to build a project index like the one that Joe has provided, then obviously you can align the work category and resource forecast to that, and then essentially build your own kind of cash flow forecast, which obviously making sure that you're utilising the latest sort of forecasts for those indices, which are updated on a monthly basis. So yeah, I think that's probably the best way of trying to cover both those aspects.
Brilliant, thank you, Carl. Wonderful. In fact, actually, that's also just reminded me. So on that topic, our next webinar, which will present some of the latest data from our fourth quarter, that's from our forecast, is going to be hosted by David Crossway in January. So we'll send out some details of how you can register for that in due course, and hopefully it's of interest to all of you. Okay, wonderful. So that actually brings us to our conclusion. That's the end of the webinar. Just wanted to say an absolutely huge thank you for all of you for attending and taking the time out. We all know time is incredibly poor at the moment, so we really, really do appreciate your support. Thanks again to Carl and Joe for taking us through those information. Hopefully you all found it a very helpful session. You can follow us on LinkedIn if you're not already. You can either just do that by searching BCIS on LinkedIn, or if you scan the QR code on the screen now, that will take you there. Also, our contact details are there at the bottom. If you've got any questions at all, as I said, genuinely, please feel free to get in touch with us. But apart from that, that's all from us. And again, huge thank you for attending.